Welcome to our deep dive on St. Joseph. He's often seen as kind of a quiet figure in the background, but today we're bringing him front and center, wouldn't you say? We've got prayers and historical accounts, even theological insights and artistic representations. It's a real mix to dig into.
Yeah, it really is. I think it's interesting how someone so central to Christianity has so little information directly from the Bible. It
hmm
makes you wonder what we can actually learn from him despite that.
Right. That mystery just makes him even more fascinating, don't you think?
Hmm.
But, okay, before we go too far down the rabbit hole, let's just start with the basics.
Yeah.
According to what we do have, who was St. Joseph?
Well, we know from his biography that he was the husband of Mary, of course,
Hmm?
the foster father of Jesus,
Hmm.
a carpenter, and actually a descendant of King David.
A descendant of King David. Wow. Okay, now that's a lineage with some weight to it.
Yeah, really, it is. That lineage connects him and Jesus, obviously, to the line of kings in Israel, which really fulfills those prophecies about the Messiah.
It's like a thread through history,
Yeah.
leading to this huge moment.
Exactly.
It makes you think about what expectations that must have put on him, that kind of lineage. But let's go to another description from the Bible that really stands out, right? A just man.
Hmm.
So what does that tell us about Joseph?
Yeah, well, in the context of the Bible, just is, more than just being fair. It implies a deep commitment to being righteous, to living in accordance with God's will.
It says a lot about him.
It really does, yeah. His integrity.
And when we consider the situation he was in with Mary, pregnant, it becomes even more significant, doesn't it?
Well.
They were legally betrothed, mostly as good as married,
Right.
and then he finds out she's pregnant. Can you imagine? Talk about a dilemma.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Jewish law at the time meant he couldn't just walk away, without serious consequences for both of them. I mean, imagine that, being in that position. He's trying to deal with this situation that could really bring shame and hardship on both of them.
And yet, his initial plan is to just quietly divorce her.
Yeah.
By protecting her from public humiliation. It shows real compassion. He's willing to give up his own reputation to protect Mary.
I think it just speaks volumes about his character, yeah.
Yeah.
He was guided by his conscience and real concern for other people.
All right. But then we get to this incredible moment, right? The angelic visitation. An angel appears in a dream. It reveals that Mary's child is conceived by the Holy Spirit. It's a life-changing thing. What do you think his reaction was?
I mean, I can only imagine it must have taken an incredible leap of faith, the weight of that revelation, the implications of it. It's mind-boggling. It would have demanded a total shift in perspective.
And the willingness to trust in something, well, beyond human understanding.
Absolutely.
And his response. He immediately accepts Mary as his wife. He embraces this role that God has put in front of him. It speaks to his faith, his trust in divine providence.
That obedience is really profound, a complete surrender to God's plan, even though he doesn't even know what it is fully yet.
Yeah. And that same trust pops up again later, when he's told to flee to Egypt, right, to protect Jesus from Herod. Yeah. Leaving everything behind, going on this dangerous journey with a young family. I mean, it's got to be terrifying.
Oh, yeah, that situation, the urgency of it, they're essentially refugees relying on just their faith to lead them. But he doesn't even hesitate. Joseph puts the safety of his family above everything else.
A protector, a provider, a man of action driven by a higher purpose.
Yeah.
What do you think was going through his head on that trip?
Fear, probably. Uncertainty, yeah. But also, I think that conviction that he was doing exactly what God wanted him to do.
And speaking of protector and provider, there are some historians who believe Joseph died before Jesus' public ministry began.
That's interesting.
That adds another layer to his story. He devoted his life to keeping Jesus safe those first crucial years.
It's like his mission was to make sure Jesus reached adulthood safely so he could then start his ministry.
It's striking how in the face of all these huge events, Joseph remained so steadfast, a quiet strength, a humility to him that's just, well, compelling.
I think that's what people connect with, even centuries later. It's not about grand gestures, about being in the spotlight. It's about living a life of integrity and devotion in this everyday moments.
Okay, so then how do WE do that? How do we tap into that same quiet strength and devotion in our own lives?
Well, that's where I think we shift from admiring him to actually trying to emulate him. We can start by looking at how each he prayed and then how we can pray to him for guidance.
All right, so two sides of the same coin, right? First, how did St. Joseph pray?
Well, from what we can gather, his prayer life was characterized by silence, humility, obedience, and unwavering trust in God's providence.
It feels so countercultural to our noisy world, doesn't it? Silence especially feels like a lost art these days.
It does, yeah. But it's often in silence that we can hear God most clearly. Think about it. Joseph wasn't a man of many words, at least not in the Bible, but his actions, those spoke volumes.
It's that deep inner reflection, right?
Right.
Attentiveness to God's guidance, not rushing to fill the space with words, but listening for direction.
Exactly. And humility. It reminds us that true greatness, well, it's often found in selfless service rather than promoting ourselves.
He never sought recognition or praise, did he? Content to live a simple life, doing his duty, just quiet dedication.
Yeah. And his obedience, it wasn't just submission, it was a choice, a conscious choice to align himself with God's will, even when it meant changing his plans, facing the unknown.
And then that unwavering trust
Yeah.
that God is working things out, even in the midst of difficulties, something I think a lot of us could learn from, don't you?
Absolutely.
So in those four qualities, silence, humility, obedience, and trust, that's a model for our own prayer lives.
Yeah.
Approaching prayer with a posture of receptivity, surrender, and faith.
I like that. It's a great framework to start with.
Okay, but now let's flip to the other side. Praying to St. Joseph. What's that about?
Well, here's where we look at his intercession, asking him to advocate for us before God. And there are lots of prayers out there dedicated to him for various intentions.
That's right. And we actually have some great examples right here in our source material. Let's start with a classic, shall we? The Memorare to St. Joseph.
Oh, the memoir is a beautiful one, yeah.
Yeah.
Very simple, very direct. It really leans into his compassion, his history of helping those who ask for his aid.
You know what? Let's just share a snippet for our listeners. Ready? Remember, O most chaste spouse of the Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who fled to thy protection, implored thy help, or sought thy intercession was left unaided.
Powerful stuff, right?
It really evokes that sense of trust, of confidence, a great way to begin or end the day in trusting your needs to him.
Then we have the daily novena prayer to St. Joseph, which, well, it asks for his guidance and his spiritual blessings. Novenas are pretty amazing for deepening our connection with a particular saint. Yeah. They help us to focus our intentions and open ourselves up to their intercession over time. This specific one to St. Joseph could easily become like a cornerstone of your daily prayer practice.
And then, of course, we have the Litany of St. Joseph, which is really a series of invocations. They highlight all these different roles he held and virtues he embodied.
Yeah, the litany is a great way to reflect on those many aspects of his life and ask for his guidance in specific areas we might need help with.
So the Memorare, the daily novena, and the Litany, each offering a slightly different way to connect with St. Joseph, to invite him into our lives.
Right. And don't feel limited to just these, though. Explore others, find what works for you, and make them a part of your daily routine.
Great advice. It's about finding those things that help us build that relationship with St. Joseph and experience his presence in our lives.
It's a journey, and as we continue this deep dive, we'll get into even more about his life and his lasting legacy.
Stay tuned for more, everyone. Welcome back to our deep dive on St. Joseph. Last time we were exploring who he was, his character, that incredible journey of his, but there's another layer we haven't really touched on yet. It's his connection to some Old Testament figures.
It's really fascinating, right? How these connections, they aren't just coincidences. They point to this deeper meaning in Joseph's story, almost like a hidden dimension to his life.
I love that. So tell me more about these Old Testament parallels. Who are we talking about? What makes these connections so compelling?
Okay, well, the most obvious one is the patriarch Joseph.
Right.
From the book of Genesis.
Okay.
Both Joseph's sons of Jacob, though centuries apart, and both, get this, described as just men.
Oh, right. We talked about that term just before. But just in case someone's tuning in for the first time, what does that mean again in the Bible?
Oh, sure. So in the Bible, just implies this righteousness, living in accordance with God's will, deep integrity, moral uprightness, characteristic of both these Josephs.
So they shared that commitment to righteousness. What other similarities are there?
Well, both of them received messages, divine messages, through dreams. Like these dreams guided their actions, revealed God's plan. Like think about the angel appearing to Joseph in a dream, telling him to take Mary as his wife.
And in Genesis, the patriarch Joseph, he interprets dreams even for the Pharaoh of Egypt.
Yeah.
It's wild how dreams play such a key role for both of them.
I know, right? And then there's the Egypt connection, too. So the patriarch Joseph, he's sold into slavery in Egypt, but rises to power and ends up saving the country from famine.
And St. Joseph
Yeah.
flees to Egypt with Mary and Jesus
Yeah.
to escape Herod. So it's this recurring idea of Egypt as a place of refuge and also divine provision.
Exactly. And in both cases, their actions in Egypt lead to, well, the preservation of this family line that is central to salvation history.
There's another parallel that I find interesting, actually. That idea of misperceived chastity. You mentioned the patriarch Joseph being falsely accused. How does that connect to St. Joseph?
Well, just picture the societal norms back then, right? So Mary's pregnant before their marriage. Joseph knows the child's not biologically his. That kind of situation, it would have led to judgments, accusations, no doubt about it.
It put him in a tough spot. Even though he's committed to Mary, those circumstances could have really messed things up for them.
Oh, absolutely. Yet in both cases, the accusations are unfounded. They're men of integrity, committed to righteousness, even when things might look otherwise. It challenges us to see beyond those surface-level judgments, you know?
It is. It's a good reminder to look at someone's character before jumping to conclusions based on their situation. So these parallels, they're fascinating. But you mentioned there's a deeper theological meaning to them. What's that about?
Well, think about it. By connecting St. Joseph to the patriarch Joseph, the Gospels are kind of subtly inviting us to see him as, well, a figure who embodies the faithfulness and righteousness of the Old Testament. Like he bridges the gap between the Old and New covenants.
So he's this thread of continuity, carrying that legacy forward,
Yeah.
like a living bridge between those two eras.
Yeah, exactly. And if you want to go even further, some scholars actually see him as like a type of Abraham, the
Yeah.
father of faith, right? Both called by God to leave home and embark on these journeys, trusting in God's promises.
That's powerful. Abraham's promised tons of descendants, and St. Joseph becomes the earthly father to Jesus, through whom, well, everyone can become a child of God.
It's incredible how it all comes together. St. Joseph, this central figure in God's plan, this link in salvation history that goes all the way back to the beginning.
It's mind-blowing when you really think about the scale of it all. But let's zoom in a bit. How does St. Joseph's example speak to the challenges men face today?
Oh, that's such an important question because honestly, there's a lot of confusion right now about what it means to be a man. All these stereotypes, outdated ideas about masculinity.
It's all about strength, being stoic, never showing emotion. It feels so limiting.
It really is. And St. Joseph, he offers this richer understanding of what manhood can be.
So what stands out to you about Joseph's masculinity? Like, what goes beyond those superficial ideas?
Well, first off, his humility. Right. We live in a world where being masculine is often equated with dominance, self-promotion. But Joseph, quiet strength, doesn't need to shout to be heard.
He's happy to work behind the scenes, just serving his family with love and dedication.
Exactly. Not seeking the limelight, just focused on what matters. And that brings us to another big one. His willingness to be vulnerable.
He's facing huge challenges, but he doesn't pretend to have it all figured out. He lets himself feel. He seeks guidance.
Yeah, like when he's initially thinking about divorcing Mary, he's grappling with so many emotions, but he chooses compassion, trust over pride.
That's true strength right there, isn't it? Acknowledging limitations, seeking guidance, letting go of that need to control everything.
Absolutely. And then there's his commitment to his family, protecting them, providing for them. Not about aggression, but selfless love, responsibility.
Constantly putting their needs first, even when it means making huge sacrifices. It's true fatherhood in action.
Right. And let's not forget his dedication to his work, you know. He finds dignity in being a carpenter. He's not afraid to work hard, to labor, to find meaning in everyday tasks.
It's a great message for us today when so many people look down on manual labor. His example says, hey, work, no matter what it is, can be fulfilling. It can honor God.
He teaches us to approach our work with integrity, with diligence, with purpose.
Okay, so we've got humility, vulnerability, protection, provision, strong work ethic. That's a pretty amazing model.
It is, right. And one more thing often gets overlooked. His discernment.
Right.
He wasn't just blindly following orders, you know. He listened carefully to God's guidance, weighed his options.
Yeah, like when he thought about divorcing Mary initially. It wasn't out of fear or lack of faith. It was that sincere desire to do the right thing in a tough spot.
He was always striving to understand God's will and then to align his actions with it. It reminds us to be engaged with our faith, to seek wisdom in our choices.
That's so crucial, especially these days when we're bombarded with so much information, so many options.
Absolutely. So you see, St. Joseph, he's this powerful counterexample to all those narrow, sometimes even harmful ideas about masculinity. He shows us that real manhood, it's about integrity, humility, vulnerability, love, service, and that deep connection with God.
It's a challenge, but an inspiring one, for sure. But it's one thing to admire these qualities, right? It's another to actually live them. Where do we even start with that?
Well, like with any spiritual practice, it begins with being aware. We need to be honest with ourselves about our strengths and weaknesses.
So asking ourselves those tough questions, where am I falling short? Am I struggling with pride? Do I have a hard time admitting I'm wrong?
Yeah, and once we see those areas, then we can start making those small changes intentionally.
And maybe it's practicing humility by saying, hey, I was wrong, or asking for help. Or maybe it's nurturing that connection with God through prayer, reflection.
Or maybe it's finding ways to serve others. In our families, communities, work. We can even ask St. Joseph directly. Pray for his help in growing those virtues.
Oh, and speaking of specific prayers, there's a beautiful one called the Consecration to St. Joseph. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. It starts by expressing that surrender, that trust. It says, "O dear Saint Joseph, I consecrate myself to thy honor and give myself to thee, that thou mayest always be my father, my protector, and my guide in the way of salvation."
Acknowledging that we need his guidance, his support.
Right. And it goes on to ask for specific virtues like, "Obtain for me a great purity of heart and a fervent love of the interior life. After thine example, may I do all my actions for the greater glory of God, in union with the divine heart of Jesus and the immaculate heart of Mary."
It's like a roadmap for living a good life, filled with love, purity, connection with the divine.
And then it ends with asking for his intercession at the hour of our death for a peaceful passing.
A reminder that he's with us every step of the way through this whole earthly journey. It's amazing that so much of what we know about St. Joseph comes from reading between the lines,
Yeah.
from the Gospels, putting together those pieces.
It's almost like he's intentionally stepping back, letting Jesus and Mary be in the spotlight.
But in that, he shows his character, that humility,
Yeah.
selflessness, qualities we don't see often enough.
He teaches us that real greatness isn't about seeking attention. It's about quietly doing your duty, loving those you're responsible for, living by God's will.
That's a message for everyone, really. A reminder that in the most ordinary life, we can find extraordinary meaning.
St. Joseph's example, it hits home. Especially today, when we're always looking for validation, fulfillment in the wrong places, he says true contentment. It's not about what you have, but who you are. We're children of God, called to love and serve with humility and joy.
That's beautiful. But before we move on, there's this one crucial part of Joseph's life we haven't really talked about yet. His role as the, legal father of Jesus.
Yes, often gets glossed over. But it points to this really profound theological truth. So yeah, Jesus is conceived by the Holy Spirit. We get that. But we also can't ignore that Joseph legally adopted him as his son.
It's a distinction, an important one to make. Some people might think that somehow diminishes Jesus' divinity. But that's not the case, right?
No, not at all. It actually enhances our understanding of the incarnation, the mystery of God becoming human.
Okay, I'm listening. How does that work?
So think about it. If Jesus had been born without a legal father, his place in Jewish society, it would have been shaky at best. He would have been considered illegitimate. All this social stigma, legal disadvantages.
And that would have made it almost impossible for him to be the Messiah, wouldn't it?
Exactly. Joseph's adoption, his willingness to take on that responsibility, it was crucial for Jesus to live a normal life and then, start his ministry.
A tiny detail with huge implications.
Right. It shows that God works even through those everyday parts of human life. Legal stuff, social norms, they can all be part of his plan.
And it makes you think about how important fatherhood is, not just biologically, but that broader sense of caring for someone, protecting them, guiding them.
Yeah, for men especially, it's powerful. That reminder of our role in shaping the lives of our kids or those we mentor.
It's the power of love, commitment. Joseph chooses to be a father, even though it wasn't biologically his. It shows how deeply he loved Mary and his trust in God's plan.
A beautiful example of how saying yes to God, even when it's tough, can have this ripple effect, way beyond our own lives.
A reminder that even the smallest acts of obedience, of love, can be part of God's grace, shaping things in ways we may never understand.
And, in a world that often downplays fatherhood or oversimplifies it, Joseph's example, it's a challenge and an inspiration.
He shows that real fatherhood. It's selfless love, sacrifice, putting others' needs before your own.
It's about stepping up, taking responsibility even when it's hard, trusting God to give you what you need to do it.
And that message, it's not just for men. It's for all of us, really. We're all called to be spiritual fathers, mothers in some way, to care for those around us, to guide them.
Whether it's our own kids, people we teach, colleagues, or just someone who needs help, we all have a chance to live out that selfless love, that service that Joseph showed us.
It's a challenging calling, but a fulfilling one. It can bring so much joy and meaning.
Before we go on to the final part of our deep dive, I think it's good to just pause for a moment, reflect on everything we've talked about.
Yeah, it's been a lot. Those parallels with the Old Testament figures, the deeper meaning of his legal fatherhood, how it all speaks to us today.
We've seen how his humility, his willingness to be vulnerable, his commitment to his family, his strength, how they all offer this different perspective on manhood.
And we've been reminded that true fatherhood, biological or spiritual, it's about way more than just playing a role. It's about love, sacrifice, saying yes to God, even when it takes us by surprise.
When we come back for part 3, we'll get into the lasting impact St. Joseph has had on the church. We'll look at some prayers and devotions you might not know about, and we'll see how his example can help us find peace, contentment in our own lives.
It's going to be a fascinating look at how this quiet but powerful saint still inspires and intercedes for us. So stick around. Welcome back to our deep dive. We've been on quite a journey with St. Joseph, haven't we? Exploring his life, his character, his amazing faith.
It's been incredible.
It has. I'm curious about the lasting impact he's had, especially in the church,
Mm-hmm.
throughout history.
It really is remarkable, isn't it, how someone who's so often depicted in silence has had such a profound and vocal impact. Speaks to the power of his example, I think.
Absolutely. One way we see that is through the sheer number of prayers and devotions dedicated to him. It's like his influence extends beyond his earthly life,
Yeah.
to guide and inspire us all these centuries later.
It's like a conversation that goes beyond time, a way to connect with his wisdom and ask for his help. But before we jump into specific prayers, remember how we talked about St. Joseph being the patron saint of the Universal Church? That's a pretty big deal.
It is. Remind us again, how did he get that title? And what does it mean for the church?
So it was officially declared way back in 1870 by Pope Pius IX. But it wasn't just out of the blue. It came after tons of petitions from people all over the world. They recognized how important Joseph was to, well, the whole story of salvation.
So he's not just for, carpenters or fathers.
Yeah.
He's for everyone.
Exactly. And why? I think it comes down to those core virtues we keep talking about. His righteousness, his obedience to God, his quiet but powerful faith and action. Those things, they speak to all of us, no matter your background or what you're going through.
He's like this ideal of how to live a good life, following God's will, no matter who you are or what obstacles you face.
That's it. And the church has really emphasized those aspects of Joseph, holding him up as a model, especially for men.
We've talked about how he challenges those old-fashioned ideas of masculinity, but how else has the church used his life to guide men?
Oh, there's so much out there. Papal encyclicals, writings from saints. They all point to Joseph as the ideal husband, father, worker. He shows us how to lead by serving, to find holiness in everyday life.
Okay, I'm getting a sense of his widespread influence. But what about those lesser-known prayers and devotions you mentioned? Any examples our listeners might connect with?
Well, one I'm fond of is the prayer to St. Joseph before work. It's short, but really powerful. A good way to ask for his guidance and protection as you start your day.
I love that. It's not about praying for, success or money, but for the ability to do your work well, with integrity, with purpose.
Exactly. Work is an offering to God, a way to live out your faith.
Another one I like is the daily prayer recited by Pope Francis. It talks about how Joseph can make the impossible possible, how he comes to our aid when we're struggling.
It reminds us that we're not alone. We can always ask St. Joseph for help.
And speaking of overcoming obstacles, there's one area where he's often invoked, finding contentment.
Ah, yes. We touched on this earlier, but it's worth repeating. In a world obsessed with more, St. Joseph's simple life, his acceptance, it really stands out.
He's like the antidote to that constant striving, that discontentment that so many of us feel.
Right. And the prayers to him for contentment, they often reflect that. Letting go of anxieties, trusting in God, finding peace in the unknown.
It's like they're leading us toward a simpler way of being. Really powerful, especially today. But, it's not just about asking St. Joseph for help. It's also about learning to pray like him.
That's key. Remember those qualities of his prayer life. Silence, humility, obedience, trust. They're not just like abstract ideas. They're things we can do.
Silence, for example, isn't just about being quiet. It's about making space to hear God amidst all the noise.
Humility isn't about putting yourself down. It's about recognizing your need for God, appreciating the good in others.
Obedience isn't blind following. It's about trying to line up your actions with God's will.
And trust isn't about ignoring problems. It's about believing that God is working, even when you can't see the whole picture.
Those things that Joseph lived out, those are the keys to finding peace and contentment in our own lives.
And anyone can do them, no matter who you are, where you come from. We can all work on these things. Let them change us.
It's about tapping into that quiet strength, that unwavering faith that Joseph embodied.
And you never know, maybe in doing that, we'll see some of those impossible things shift. Those worries start to fade. And we'll experience that deep peace that just seems to radiate from Joseph.
It's a journey worth taking. And St. Joseph, he's the perfect guide. We've covered so much, haven't we? His life, his role, how it challenges us, the power of those prayers.
Amazing how this quiet, often overlooked figure still has so much to teach us. He reminds us that true greatness is often found in humility, in serving others. Contentment comes from aligning ourselves with God's will, and that even in the most ordinary life, we can find extraordinary meaning.
He's a powerful intercessor, a
Yeah.
protector, a guide, and more than anything, he's a model of faith in action. And so as we wrap up, we leave you with this. If St. Joseph were here today, what advice would he give you about navigating this crazy world, staying true to God's call?
Think about that. Let his quiet strength inspire you. Let his faith guide your steps. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, everyone.